early dawn, though dark and cold in the loft. A rat squeaked and scuttled along a rafter. The boy shivered. He detested rats. He was rolling a tiny swag, just a threadbare rug and towel. He did the job neatly, strapping the folds tightly. Then stood in shirt and trousers, worn boots, and a battered felt hat that quite hid his wavy brown hair. He listened, his brown eyes serious. Barely 13, yet determination showed on that childish face. Not a sound. He clutched his pocket. Yes, it was there. 5 shillings. All the money he had in the world. He crept down from the loft to a horse, tied under a tree outside. Quietly, he led it across the yard and out the gate. With a lump in his throat, he shook his bridle rein and rode away into the dawn. It was early in 1870, and the world this boy knew was a small place indeed, but he felt sure there was a great world farther out, beyond the barrier range across the border of New South Wales. Out there, somewhere, Big Brother George was working on a new cattle station. Beyond the barrier, he vaguely sensed there were great areas of country that knew not the white man. A country out past the farthest limits of the sheepmen and the cattlemen. Surely there must be room for him out there. The sun brightened the crowns of the lovely Adelaide Hills. He was riding north, leaving the young city behind. The deeply rutted Kapunda Road, hedged with its gums and rolling downs and vales, stretched before him. Smoke now was rising from the chimneys of the farmhouses. The fresh air was sweeter for the call of birds. The sun warmed the stiff old bones of the horse that answered so willingly to the softly voiced encouragement of the boy. Good old Cyclops. A lad who went to school had assured him that Cyclops was a one-eyed giant who could run faster than a racehorse. He had no breakfast, but he didn't mind. No lunch either, though he was hungry when he rode over the Gawler Bridge. Proudly, he rode through the street of the bright little town, its stone houses pretty with gardens and trees foretelling prosperity to a growing agricultural district. He rode on into the country with its low, grassy slopes, its level fields, its dark green paddocks of gum falling rapidly, alas, to the axe. Every mile was of interest. His quick eye and mind missed nothing. Across the paddocks and hills on both sides of the road, men were working. Horses were pulling a plough, cart or wagon. Constantly passing him were buggies and wagonettes, dray or wagonette carting produce to the hungry young city. All the vehicles were pulled by horses or bullocks. What a market for horses and bullocks must exist in this district. He rode eagerly on. His education already commenced. Just at sundown, he saw the roofs of Kapunda gleaming above the trees some miles ahead. Then he rode down among the little hills and emerged to see lights twinkling like a welcome through the gloom. Old Cyclops had done remarkably well. 50 miles that day. He put up at the Prince of Wales Hotel. Before he dined, he made sure that Cyclops was enjoying a good meal in a warm stall. Next morning he paid his bill. 1 shilling for dinner, 1 shilling for bed, 1 shilling for breakfast, 1 shilling for Cyclops. He mounted and rode away, 1 shilling left in his pocket, and not a worry in his head. Soon he turned off on the road that leads to the borough. That day, he passed some fine teams hauling copper from the borough mines to Port Adelaide and estimated the capacity and value of each team. Late that afternoon, Cyclops showed signs of knocking up. Dismounting, the boy led the old horse. He had to nurse it. With 1 shilling, it represented his fortune. Cyclops was the first animal he'd ever owned, and he loved it. Sundown came, and in the chilly dusk, Sid walked on, leading his horse, feeling lonely and hungry. Presently he saw the twinkle of a fire, and hopefully turned from the road shadows. Cyclops pricked his ears and sniffed the smoke. It was a mule camp near Black Springs, and a roughly clad man was just lifting the billy off. He glanced up at the boy's approach.
Good evening, lad.
Good evening, mister.
You come far?
No, from Kapunda. My horse knocked up.
Well, better turn him out. Then come and have something to eat.
Thanks.
You come from Adelaide way?
Yeah.
Been any rain down there?
Not for the last few miles. But there's plenty of good feed around the hills.
You heard anything of Big John Forrest?
No? He's an explorer, isn't he?
Yeah, one of the best. He left Perth about 5 months ago with his brother Alexander and a party to try and come overland to Adelaide.
Is it far?
Oh, about 1,500 miles or more by the route he may take.
Do you think he'll do it?
Sure. Neither bush, nor desert, nor distance can beat Big John.
You seem to like him.
Every Western Australian does.
How many people are there in Western Australia?
Oh, only 25,000, but they'll come. They'll come. If only they could find gold as they have in Victoria, there wouldn't be enough ships to carry the men there.
These explorers must be great men.
Oh, they are. They go out to those deserts, wild blacks, plains or mountains ahead of them. They're lost to the world until they return, and if they fail, well, there's no help for them. They blaze the way, the pioneers follow, and we follow the pioneers.
The boy was a willing listener while the man talked. His shrewd questions drew willing replies. After breakfast next morning, he saddled Cyclops, and then turned to his friend with a shilling in his hand, a smile on his face.
Thank you very much, mister. I'm sorry, it's all I have.
Ah, you're welcome, my lad. Keep the money, you'll need it.
Years later, the boy sought this man who so nicely refused his shilling. He never found him. Burra Township had been busy under the copper boom ever since Pickett, the shepherd, found copper in 1845. Prosperous shops, the long street alive with horse and bullock teams, horsemen riding by, miners thronging in from the mines, a drover coming in with a mob of cattle. Burra was the then terminus of the railway, just completed from Adelaide. This township, with its atmosphere of future growth, was far more interesting than a storybook to the restless eyes of the boy. Slowly he rode through the town, impressing its business on his mind, trying to gauge its future possibilities. The activities here obviously used many horses and bullocks. Someday, he might sell this town horses and cattle. With a deep breath, he rode on, his serious brown eyes lending thoughtfulness to his face. He wanted to find a job quickly, a job farther out, where he could grow as the country grew. It was at a roadside hotel at Old Mount Bryan that he met Harry Russ and Charlie Hames. They'd come from Mundy Station to the Burra for rations and were about to return. The boy had met them months ago at the Adelaide sale yards, when they'd come down with a mob of Mundy cattle.
Where to, young fella?
My brother at the barrier.
What, George? You've got a long ride ahead of you.
I'll get there. Do you know where he is?
Yeah, he's at Poolamacca Station somewhere with a droving plant. You can come along with us if you like.
Thanks. I'd be pleased.
Hey,
Where'd you get that horse?
I bought him.
You'll never make a horse dealer, lad.
You'll never reach Poolamacker on that old bag of bones. You should have sold him to the boneyard.
Anyway, you take your swag across to our dray over there and keep an eye on our horses. Now, we'll be along presently and you can come onto the barrier with us. You give us your horse and we'll see if we can get him a feed.
Thanks very much.
His two friends took the old horse across to the hotel, and there sold it for 10 shillings, which they promptly drank. When the boy realized what had happened, he stared across at the rough bush pub, cold fury mingling with the tears in his eyes.
I'll never drink, so help me God I won't.
When they did move on, his job was to drive the spare horses plodding along behind the ration dray. Here he immediately made friends with the dog. Day by day, they plodded out into the real bush, the farming lands now left behind. This was the land of stations, the homesteads gradually appearing at longer and longer distances apart. Slow traveling in those days. Quickly the boy learned to make a damper, to boil a billy without smoking the water, to find the horses in the early dawn. Day by day, as he walked on behind the dray, his roaming eyes were memorizing the country with a memory that had not faded 60 years later. It was a labor of love. The birds, the trees, the grasses, the hills, the scarce waterholes, the very air of the bush, he felt was his. As day by day they journeyed farther north, the boy noticed the country changing. There were no running creeks here. The only water was in isolated brown holes. They passed through the mallee belt, then out onto plain country, and were in the land of the sparse rainfall. The boy gazed upon a dull, grey carpet stretching far away. He'd never seen saltbush before. At night, from the two men smoking as they yarned, sprawled out on their blankets beside the fire, the boy quietly learnt all they knew of the bush, and of the men and the stock, and the country farther out. One day there slowly formed before them, far away out across a grey saltbush plain that stretched across the New South Wales border, the harsh, grey outline of the Barrier Range. And one sundown, to the barking of dogs, they drove up to the roughly built homestead of Mundy Mundy. This meant journey's end for Hames and the horses. Next morning, after a yarn with the manager, Harry came to the boy.
Your luck's dead in, young'un. I've got to ride across to Poolamacker with a message for the boss. Your brother is working somewhere near the new station, so you can come along with me.
Thanks.
Charlie says he'll lend you his mare. You better go and see him about it, and then go and ask for some rations from the cook.
Poolamacker station was 60 miles farther along in the Barrier Range. Harry and the boy followed a shortcut, which soon faded into a faint pad, winding ever deeper in among the hills. As they rode from the red gums along the big dry creeks, cockatoos and galahs rose in shrieking protest. The boy's delight was brought suddenly to earth as Harry reined in.
Hold hard, Sid. We'll have a drink. My coppers are burning. Catch the pack horse.
You right, Harry? Here, boy. Oh, the water bag's still hanging round his neck. The cork's out. The bag's dry.
Hot as the hobs of Hades, too. Well, there's water in the creek just ahead. We'd better push on.
But there was no water in the creek, nor in the next. The creeks of the Barrier Range are large, sandy creeks lined with red gums, carrying running water only during heavy rain. Some held a waterhole at intervals of miles apart. Otherwise, the beds were broad stretches of shingle and hot sand. By midday, they were pushing anxiously on under a blazing sun. The leaves of the dead finished shrubs were drooping. In mid-afternoon, Harry dismounted and tied his horse under a shady tree.
You go on, Sid. Don't lose the pad. I've had too much booze lately to travel long without a drink on a day like this. I'll follow on when it gets cool.
He stretched wearily out in the shade while the boy rode on uneasily, the thirsty foal plodding along behind. The mulga swallowed them up. The sun of mid-afternoon was upon the hot, still bush. Near sundown, the boy dismounted and unsaddled and hobbled his mare. He stood there, feeling awfully thirsty. The yearling commenced noisily sucking the mother. The boy stared. Then, snatching his pannikin, pushed the reluctant foal away and commenced milking the mare. He won half a pannikin of milk, despite foal and mother. But his face was clouded with disgust as he drank the sticky stuff. Night fell with a lonely, deathly quiet. Not a leaf moved. The boy lit a fire, and the crackling flames brought companionship. An hour later, and his mare lifted her head and whinnied. An answering whinny came from away in the bush. Harry rode up and wearily dismounted, his eyes bloodshot. He talked disjointedly. The boy watched him. It was frightening that the man should show so early the signs of going to pieces. The boy fought off a sudden fear, fought to hold his own confidence. From the darkness among the trees, coals flamed eerily, then vanished to green eyes that also vanished. Then a dingo howl rose to the skies. Another howl brought another, and yet another. All night they howled, from among the trees, from the rocks, from the gullies, the mournful echoes wavering away among the dark places in the hills. At daylight, their horses were missing. With better bushcraft than the humans, they'd gone to seek their own water.
We're up against it now. We daren't waste time tracking them. Get some of that tucker out of the pack bag. We'll have to walk straight on until we find water.
Man and boy stepped out, comparatively cheery in the early hours, while the birds were singing and coolness was over the bush. But when the hush and heat of midday came, they were both in a bad way. Their lips were blistered, their tongues so swollen that the choking effort to breathe fanned the raging thirst within. Then in the mind there grew fear.
It must be the next creek. The last creek. If there's not water there...
They struggled on and came to Harry's last creek. It was dry. Harry sank down under a shady bush. His bloodshot eyes were sunken, his lips the hue of burnt leather.
I can't go any farther.
The boy stared silently at this terrible thing. A man who had given in.
Please, God, direct me to where the water is.
He plodded on, only to stumble, but steadying himself, went more resolutely forward. He tried to forget that queer buzzing in his ears. His face felt big and hot, the skin was tight. He battled on for several miles, then suddenly realized he was on bullock tracks. He followed them with a trembling hope. They led to a precipitous slope. Wonderingly, he gazed up. Surely even thirsty cattle would never climb such a place. It ended high up on a wall of rock. Doggedly, he followed on. Then he heard the chirping of birds, like faint tinklings in the sky. Trembling with excitement, he climbed, snatching at the bushes, clawing higher among the rocks. At the foot of the cliff gleamed a pool, around which hundreds of birds were quarreling and playing and bathing. He dashed in among them and fell in the pool and imagined he was drinking it, dry, dry, dry. Actually, he couldn't swallow. He just lay there until the water brought life to his lips, feeling to his throat. At last, he splashed up, and laughing, stumbling, falling, he made his way back to Harry. The man lay still, huddled there in the dark.
I found water, Harry. Harry! Harry, water! Wake up, wake up! Harry, I found water! Water, Harry, water!
But he had to shake Harry, to lift his head and shake him again and again. When Harry understood, he staggered and swayed there, clutching the boy. And they reached the rock pool late in the night. Very quiet by the fire among the rocks, the boy lay thinking. Water. The most precious thing on earth. It was life. Lack of it meant death to every living thing. This realization was eventually to mean fortune to him. Harry had given in. If he'd given in too, they would never have found the water. They would be dead. He let the lesson sink in.
Never give in. I will never give in.
Next morning, Harry had regained confidence.
I remember that range in the distance. We should drop down into Poolamacca over that range. It's about 30 miles from here. Come on!
Harry was right this time. That evening, they saw the station lights blinking through the bush.
Thank God. Every bone in my body is one big ache. I can barely put one foot before the other. You're a wonder, boy. How do you do it?
Oh, I just keep on going.
Luckily for me. Listen. The dogs are barking. We'll soon be there.
By the slush lamp in the station kitchen, they ate a ravenous meal, after which Greasy Jack, the cook, congratulated the boy on his breaking into the bush.
Your brother will be along in the morning, young'un, and if he don't kill you for running away from home, I'll get you a job off-siding for me. What? You're asleep? Oh, the poor kid does look done in.
Early next morning, German Charlie and George Kidman arrived at the station kitchen.
Hello, George.
You young ass. Why did you run away from home?
Because I wanted to.
Oh, did you? Well, you go straight back.
I'm not going back.
Oh, you're not?
No, I like it too much.
You do you? Well, this is a man's country, not a boy's.
I can do a man's work.
What?
The young'un has got, what you call it, grits. He might be handy about the place.
Handy my eye. What would he be handy at?
Oh, shooting the bush rangers in the hills, or hunting wild black mans. Lead the boy with me.
Yours isn't the responsibility. I've got enough on my hands without being burdened by a schoolboy.
Well, I don't see how you can get him back to Adelaide under 6 months, and by that time he'll be a man.
He would have been sent straight back home could the elder brother have done so. But there were no trains out there in those days, and neither ration wagon nor traveller might be leaving for the southwest for 6 months to come. George Kidman was a stern man, a droving contractor working on the fringes of settlement. He glared at the boy, puzzled what to do with him, then abruptly left the kitchen.
You win your battle. George, he know not what to do. By George, he good brother meet you. He make you work like a horse.
Until he does, you skip out to the wood heap and get busy with the axe.
In the days that followed, the lad worked hard for the old cook, but he felt restless, wanted to be up and doing. All men were restless. The year 1870 marked a big forward movement in each colony. The building of railway lines, roads, bridges, and telegraphs. This year ushered in the last phase of exploration, a new move forward of occupation and development. One morning, George rode up to the kitchen leading a spare riding horse. Throwing down a small yellow blanket, a quart pot, knife and fork, and 2 green hide straps.
Here's your swag. Roll it. We're leaving now.
Where are we going?
I'm going away driving.
The boy rolled the swag, strapped it to the saddle and mounted. He smiled so long to Greasy Jack, and passing the shanty waved farewell to the bellowing laugh of old German Charlie. They rode for 30 miles among the low, mulga-covered ridges that are the foothills of the Barrier Range. The sun shone from a glorious sky. The blue bush, a sombre carpet splotched by scarlet patches of Sturt's desert pea.
I've got you a job at 8 shillings a week. Shepherding stock for Harry Raines. You'll find it a rough job.
Harry Raines is rough.
Yeah, what do you know about him?
He's as rough as the hills. Owns 30 horses, 320 old sheep that he bought from Corona Downs at a shilling a head, and 50 goats. He overlanded with his wife in an old shandry dan. It was almost rattling to pieces. They came across from Swan Hill on the New South Wales-Victorian border. Took a year on the trip. He's a freelance. Squats down wherever the feed is good. Owns no country. Smart hand with stock and a bushman. His wife's as good as battler as he is.
How on earth do you know all that?
I listened to the men talking at German Charlie's.
You'll soon know the run of the country.
I'm going to know all of Australia someday.
Well, see, you don't know too much. The bush has a way with people who can't mind their own business. And a way with the know-alls, too.
All the bush is my business. I love it. And as for the know-alls, well, I can learn all and keep it in my head.
Yeah, you'll soon fall out of love with the bush when you've been with Raines a while. You'll live like a dingo and work like a horse.
He did. His camp was a dugout in the bank of a creek, with blackfella Billy for company. In the cold of winter nights, all he had to cover him was that little yellow rug. He and the blackfellow and the blackfellow's dog shared it, side by side, for warmth. Their ration was 8 pounds of flour per week, 2 pounds of black sugar, 1/4 of a pound of adulterated tea. That flour had been 6 months coming by wagon. When they sieved the weevils and hairy grubs out of it, they tried to bake it, but it would never bake hard. And when the grubs were red ones, the flour used to bake a rusty pink. Occasionally, the boy and Billy enjoyed a share in a goat, a feast indeed. They eked out their meat supply by the boy minding the sheep, while Billy hunted the creeks for possums. At daylight, they drive the sheep and goats away to pasturage among the hills, returning at sundown to shepherd them into a rough brush yard as protection from dingoes. But the boy gloried in the life. Despite the rough food, he began to grow, to find a laugh for each little discomfort. He developed a habit of falling asleep whenever he wished, a habit he cultivated to great advantage in later life. Soon he knew each sheep and goat as an animal with individual characteristics. He studied them, noting how like they were to a mob of men. He learned too those grasses the animals loved, the saltbush, the cottonbush, the herbage, and the grasses they would only eat when dry times came. He learned that stock will thrive on various species of bushes and even trees, saw that they'll eat the wind-blown leaves of certain trees, will forage among rocks and fallen timber for seeds and nuts and pods and certain roots. He learned probabilities and signs by means of which waterholes may be located in apparently dry creeks and in rock holes in valley or gorge, and that often you can dig in a dry creek bed and obtain soakage water if you dig in the right place. He saw that the blacks, the wallabies, the wild dogs, even the horses do this. His eyes and his senses began instinctively searching the country for water and the possible location of water. Becoming the best of friends with Billy, he studied his blackfellow mate. With pride, Billy passed the long, lonely days in teaching this lad, who was so understanding, and was such a glutton to learn the only things that interested Billy. So began that education in bushcraft, which was to save his life, to make him a noted bushman, and to guide him to fortune in the years to come. He learnt to pick out landmarks, to stand upon hill or plain, and, across hazy distance, note a landmark capable of identification for all time. Billy was a hard taskmaster, a scornful teacher, but delighted and loud in praise for a job well learnt. This boy's phenomenal memory never failed. Later he was to return time and again to a waterhole, a pad, a flat, a hill that he'd seen only once 20 years before and remembered instantly. The previous year, flood had ravaged the Darling in northwestern New South Wales. Now a bigger one came, spreading over the flat country 20 miles on either side of the river. Struggling settlers were flooded out, and some with their herds sought the higher lands farther out towards the barrier 80 miles west. Then, away down in South Australia, a drought broke. Unable to travel by the resultant grass, South Australian cattle came pouring in over the border from the Flinders Ranges and spread out in mobs, lowing their way across the barrier country. When the vanguard of these new land seekers appeared, the boy saw another phase of pioneer life. The big herds, hungry and thirsty, the bullock drays, the brown-faced horsemen seeking new land. He watched eagerly, feeling the struggle of man and bush, longing to join in before the last of the new lands was all taken up. Over the hills one day there appeared an Aboriginal horseman, followed by a mob of cattle, with a white man riding behind, his dog close by. Farther back came lumbering a wagon, and driving the wagon, a woman. The man's name was Abraham Wallace. Wallace selected the very country on which Rains had temporarily squatted. He was unaware of Rains' presence until one day he rode upon the bough shed by the creek. There was a furious row. But Wallace had right with him. Wallace was a legitimate squatter prepared to select country by the laws of the land and make a permanent home upon his choice. Rains packed up the old Shandridan, mustered his considerably increased flock, and away he rode. In this clash of the pioneers, young Sid Kidman lost his job.
I'm sorry, lad. You've been worth a couple of men to me, but, well, I've got to go out and battle again, and you'll have to do the same. The luck of the bush.
There's plenty of room in the bush for you and me. We both own stations yet.
That's the spirit. You stick to it, Sid, and you'll be a squatter.
The boy rolled up his little yellow rug and started across bush towards Mount Gipp's station. He whistled as he walked, while his eyes took in the pictures the bush was showing. The saltbush on the plains, the mulga and mallee on the hills, the long, steady flight of cockatoos high up that told they were travelling to some distant waterhole. He would watch such a flight until the birds vanished like butterflies flitting over the horizon. He might want water out there someday. As the miles went by, he trudged steadily towards the broken hill, a black crest rising, rugged and barren, a landmark for shepherd, stockman and wanderer. He'd climbed that broken hill with Billy the black boy, and from its crest gazed north as Sturt had years before. The great explorer had stared north, seeking the inland sea of his dreams. The lad stared into the haze, dreaming of lands far out. But neither explorer nor wandering boy dreamt that the rocky bastion upon which they stood was to prove a hill of destiny to Australia. Mount Gipp's, of 1,400 square miles, established about 4 years before in the heart of the Barrier Range, was now the big station of the district. West of where the boy stood, until well into South Australia, was no man's country, while north was only now being dotted by the farther-out pioneers. As the lad walked on into the heart of the ranges, he felt as happy and free as the wallabies that played among the rocks. In after years, he used to think wonderingly of that walk, for those wallabies were playing upon silver. They were sleeping, living, and eating upon a silver plate as large as a range of hills. And he walked over it. Walked whistling with his few precious pounds rolled tightly in his pocket. Walked serenely along beside a mountain of silver. Sid secured a job at Mount Gibbs Station at 10 shillings per week as a rouseabout. This was luxury compared to the job with Harry Raines and that hole in the creek bank. Here was a big station with a homestead, men's quarters, and outbuildings of mud and stone. Here was a real manager and overseer, and 40 station hands. Men in leggings and spurs, riding from daylight to dark, coming home singing, and after a wash, filing in noisily to the huge table in the big kitchen. He rode often for days, sometimes for weeks at a time, before returning to the homestead. And he memorized something new with every ride. Moving a mob of sheep to fresh pastures or waters, packing out the shepherd's rations, spying out the country far beyond the station borders, taking a turn with every job that forms the active life of a pioneer station. He learnt the carrying capacity of this particular area of saltbush country, the growth and endurance of stock bred in large numbers, the management of them for the cycle of the year. He grew into a good-looking boy, smart and active, blessed with a smiling willingness. He had only to ask, and information was his. He learned to handle and ride buck jumpers in that quickest of schools, a stockyard full of unbroken, snorting horses, wild as the hills. The dust and excitement, the scurrying hoofs, the glint of a roguish eye was joy to these men. The throwing of a rope over a colt, the holding him while saddling his untamed body, the leap to the saddle, and the thrill as the animal plunged and bucked and reared. From a passing drover, the boy bought a horse for 30 shillings. A poor horse, apparently worn out. But it was a young horse, and the boy knew of a valley growing succulent feed. In 2 months, that bag of bones was a fresh young horse, deep-chested, fiery of eye. The boy tried unavailingly to sell him for £5. He swapped him eventually for 2 horses, dog poor. These 2 he fattened and sold to a tank contractor for £4 each. The profit of £6 10 shillings thrilled him. Thereafter, no hawk was keener for a meal than he was to make a deal. He asked the overseer for a rise in wages. He got the sack instead. So young Sid rolled his swag, received his cheque, and set off in boyish resentment over the hills again for Pulamaca. He'd worked his hardest at Mount Gibbs. In his pocket now was £52 10 shillings. He longed for a good riding horse, an animal that would give him standing among bushmen. As he walked, he fell to pondering on the stock he carried in his pocket. 400 old ewes at 1 shilling per head. 9 cattle at £2 per head. A horse at £5. And enough over to buy saddle and blankets. Why, men had started a station with less. A station. He gazed around at the sunlit bush. The world felt big and brave, full of unrealized possibilities. He decided to camp at the shepherd's shed that night in the range. At sunrise, he was walking again with a long, steady stride that did not ease until he saw the sun set dully red upon the roof of German Charlie's shanty down in the country below. Soon he was smiling to a boisterous welcome.
What now, Sid? Why was this?
Got the sack, Charlie.
Oh, no, yes. For why?
Because I asked for a rise.
Oh, what a joke. For a rise, he asks, and the boot they give. Well, come and feed us and talk what was to be done.
Charlie gave him a job at 25 shillings a week to look after his cattle, a mysteriously increasing herd. This was a wonderful job. Big money. Charlie owned 500 cattle, and they had the world to run in. And the bush had its own opinion about Charlie's cattle, but Charlie defended his honor. Nothing could have pleased the boy more than looking after Charlie's cattle. He was his own boss, on a job that he loved. All day long in the saddle, shepherding his precious 500 over unfenced country, roaming here, roaming there, 20, 50 miles away, it didn't matter. Picking out the grassy flats, locating water, watching them grow fat, learning to know each beast individually, learning the mob temper. Often camped with only the tinkling horse bell and his spotted dog for company. He fought the dangerous loneliness of the bush at night and eventually conquered it. But he always respected it. As a sideline for quick fingers, he plaited greenhide whips, halters, head ropes and fashioned greenhide hobbles. For these he found a fair sale from travelling bush workers. Even German Charlie's shanty, crude and vicious in some respects, was destined to play its part in the opening up of the country. For travellers, such places isolated on lonely roads perhaps fulfilled the necessity of times now happily past. This particular shanty was a rude building divided into low rooms of untrimmed wood, mud and stone. The few beds were of axe-hewn mulga, the mattresses of bullock hide. There was a bucket of water outside if anybody wanted to wash. In the rough eating house, the food was plentiful and the best procurable. The tin plates and pannikins spotlessly clean. No man ever had to pay for food, not even the penniless ones. To eat cost nothing, but drink cost money. No squatter, drover or contractor ever liked a wayside shanty, for its doubtful pleasures periodically enticed their men away from the saltbush plains and dingo-ridden hills.
Some weeks later, the boy received orders from German Charlie.
Sid, my boy, you will tomorrow go meet the horseback, and you must tell everyone that German Charlie was make the race meeting when the Mount Gibbs shearing was finished. You was the shearers tell, the danksinkers, and the stockmen, and everybody on the stations to come. Danksinkers and roustabouts and station hands and teamsters, and you must tell them to make the news go round. Everybody's to come, I want. Charlie's race meetings. There was travellers, plenty coming, and men from the Lachlan with horses. You will ride then the horse onto Corona, and was go all round the country 100 miles away and more. You will take one horseback and Tucker, and their friends till make one big meeting. Tell everybody else, and tell them boys are coming up with the teams, rum, whiskey, wine, everything. Good grog that will drive away the dinkbats, and good companions that will help them drink it. But, my boy, don't let the squatters or the bank contractors hear you, or shoot you quick they will.
That was a long, meandering ride to spread the news. But to the boy, it sowed the ambition to acquire one of the finest stations in the corner. 20 miles north was Corona, a huge station recently formed, its boundaries stretching right to the South Australian border. The boy reined in his horse on a hill overlooking the hut and gazed over great stretches of hill and plain with mulga and mallee, herbage and saltbush, cottonbush and bluebush. Behind him was the sombre grey of the Barrier Range, interspersed with hills of limestone. As he looked on the low, rolling hills, grass covered as far as the eye could reach, and with the green threads of gum tree creeks winding among them, the face of this boy of 16, with less than 100 pounds to his name, slowly flushed. He desired to own Corona. The boy had the vision of a dreamer, but in him too was developing a far-seeing mind, spurred to action by a determined will.
I'll live and grow like a gum on a creek, and if ever I'm brought low, I'll spring up again, like the saltbush on the plains.
German Charlie's race meeting was craftily timed. Numerous teams were converging on the district. Those teamsters, not within easy reach of the meeting, camped their cumbersome wagons and rode across the country to the rendezvous. Shearers, station hands, bushworkers came riding from a radius of 200 miles. Some camped quietly down the creek. Most camped around and in the shanty. A sun-tanned crowd, all in their Sunday best. Tight-fitting white moleskins, leggings, elastic side boots, belt and spurs. Soft shirt open at the neck, sleeves rolled neatly, a spotted or black handkerchief loosely knotted around the neck. Broad-brimmed cabbage tree hats. Soon the shanty bar was overcrowded. Every room was crowded. Men were lying about the veranda, around by the kitchen, down the creek, and along the dusty road. The first night had not well started, for the wild Irish lad and Kelly the rake were rolling over and over, each trying to gouge the other's eyes out. From the dimly lit shanty, above a hum of voices, came the mournful cadences of the wild colonial boy.
Crying as he leant on his elbow and said, "Wrap me up in my stock whip and blanket and bury me deep down below, where the dingoes and crows will not find me, in the shade where the clover was grown."
Oh, let's have another chorus.
Wrap me up in my stock whip and blanket and bury me deep down below, where dingoes and crows.
From the sound of things, it was going to be a great race meeting. There was much saddling up on the first race day and preliminary riding with clatter of hooves and dust as whooping horsemen came galloping to scatter the crowd before the shanty. Young Kidman was busy that week of calms and turmoils, shepherding and watering the horses of the visitors, killing for the table, carting water for the cook, among a score of other duties. Meanwhile, doing a brisk business selling hobbles, halters, and green-hide pack bags. Busy, too, learning. His ears, his questions, and his memory, more eager than his fingers and body. This was a unique opportunity, by far the largest gathering of men since it left Adelaide. There were men who travelled on the Queensland side, in South Australia, in Victoria, in Western Australia. And their tales of country, of horse and cattle and sheep, of men and dogs, of timber, of rivers and range and plain, of town and mining camp, of stock routes and river dreadnoughts, enlarged the boy's mental horizon by tens of thousands of square miles. Sid picked out two little groups who, while smoking and quietly seeing all that was doing, yarned together, obviously intending to drink but little. He paid special attention to the conversation of these men, and was repaid.
Yeah, well, I suppose things might move in this country. The land's good, despite the low rainfall. There'll be failures, of course, among the stations, but then successes as they learn to know the country better.
Well, I have an idea things will move before that.
Why'd you say that?
Oh, minerals.
Oh, you don't mean gold?
No, there's too much of that in the white quartz rush 8 years ago. Some of that crowd tried to push in from the South Australian side and perished of thirst.
Yep.
Others died of fever when they got here, dry times and waterholes full of typhoid. No, I think it'll be silver this time.
You reckon?
Pat Green brought in some light-little stone to Menindee a week ago. He's packing about in the hills at some place the niggers call Whakaringa.
Whakaringa? It'll take time to develop even a rich show in this outlandish spot.
Oh, yeah, perhaps, but let them only find one and prove it. The transformation would follow nearly as quickly as a dust storm.
Looks as if minerals might cause a move in the Cobar district.
Yeah?
I came across from there with a mob of sheep for Netley Station, on the Darling, you know.
Yeah.
Cobar's rough country, poorly watered too. Two chaps, Hartman and Campbell, found it by accident about 3.5 years ago, near the end of '69, they tell me. They camped one evening at a native well and they were scared of the water.
What?
Oh, it was clear, but greeny with a bright red rust at the bottom. There were greeny blue stains like paint down the side of the hole. They thought they'd be poisoned if they drank the water.
Yeah.
Next morning, they saw gold in the ashes of the fire.
You're joking.
They raked it out and found it was beads of melted copper.
Ah.
The well was where the Aborigines had been gouging out the ochres, you know, for their war paint. A chap called Barton came along next year and put money into it to test the place. If it proves rich enough, you'll get teams to cart machinery in there.
Oh, things might move there then.
Oh, yeah. Horses and cattle and sheep will be needed. There'll be plenty of work. Teamsters have more loading than they can carry even now. The place isn't even opened up yet.
How's things in Queensland?
Oh, moving. The country's moving and changing. I think the shepherding days will soon be over. Wherever you go, you hear talk of fences. Squatters are discussing gauges of wire like they used to discuss good shepherds. Teams are carting wire all over the place. Any sort of fencer can get a job anywhere. When those fences are put up, the shepherd's job is done. Fences will bring in the boundary rider.
There must be good country there.
Oh, it's wonderful. In the centre and towards the west, great rolling plains.
Oh, lovely.
Did you hear of any rumour of a gold rush in the territory?
Yeah, but only rumour. They dug gold from the post holes while building the overland telegraph line.
By listening, and only talking in the right place at the right time, the boy learnt much. The evening of the first day, while the crowd was arguing over the judge's decisions, he caught Bullocky Bill's eye.
Boy, can you ride a racehorse?
Yeah.
Listen, I've watched you. You seem pretty slick on a horse. Will you ride Yellow Boy in the squatter's plate?
What's it worth?
A tenner if you win, and I'll break your neck if you lose.
I might lose.
I won't ride him unless he's got speed. How about I try him out tomorrow before anyone's awake?
Right. Put it there. And I'll give you something else besides.
What?
The pick of my bitch's pups. The best cattle bitch on the Darling.
I'll have a look at him. Wow. £10. If I could win, that would mean £10 for my riding horse.
Bullocky Bill really thought Yellow Boy was a Melbourne Cup winner. He was prepared to fight or bet on it. Yellow Boy was a large-boned, leggy horse with a wicked eye. Many a dry track had made him as hardy as a wallaby. He was a rogue and knew his way about the bush. However, he had a turn of speed, as the delighted boy proved next morning in the squatter's plate. With his face cut by flying gravel, he galloped from the dust full pelt around the hill towards the gate, with the ring of hoofs, the shouts of riders, the lash of whips ringing in his ears. And he beat the nearest horse right on the post, to the roar of Bullocky Bill. The boy took his pick of the cattle bitch's pups, patting her head to the beseeching sorrow in her eyes. He was delighted with the squirming little thing in his hands. He'd chosen it after the greatest care. There and then, he christened it Nelson. With his £10 riding fee, he bought a fine roan colt. He had admired it out on Abraham Wallace's run. He'd been friends with the baby colt from the first day he saw it. The colt had come gamely up to him, gazing from big, wondering eyes. Many years later, he was to cry beside it when it died of extreme old age. With the race meeting over, the sober ones, and those moderately so, got the kid to run in their horses while they packed their swags. And then they rode away. The boy rode away to his beloved cattle. They had had a whole week of roaming to themselves. Out in the mulga with his cattle, the boy was thinking. He was sitting his young roan, Prince, with his right leg across the knee pads, the horse feeding around the browsing cattle, and Nelson the cattle pup toddling at his heels. He was wondering about the efficiency of swearing. Did it really help a man to do a better job? When a man swore, he generally lost his temper, and the more he swore, the more he fuddled the job. He'd seen men fly into a fury. Then all their thoughts were whirled up in a frenzy of swearing. They seemed tired after it, and thoughts meant everything. The boy had decided that if he was to make a fortune, it must be with his thoughts. He would learn to drive his mind as he rode a horse, with a loose rein when all was going well, firm when difficulties loomed ahead. He swung his leg back over the saddle and rode off around the herd. He'd made up his mind never to swear. The boy bought a teamster's cast-off bullock for £2. It was an old piker, worked to the very bone. He put it on succulent feed in a gully fed by a reedy waterhole, and tended it as if it were a prize beast. And the beast responded by growing big and fat and lazy. The boy sold the bullock to a tank contractor, but the money after delivery was not forthcoming. One evening the boy learnt the contractor had shifted camp to 40 miles away. He saddled up and rode straight through bush all night, and at dawn located his bullock among the contractor's horses. He drove that bullock away and back to German Charlie's. Young Kidman resolved that any deal he made would be square, and he would expect a square deal in exchange. He would fight for it if he didn't get it. A week later, he sold that bullet for £6. He was to buy cattle in tens of thousands, but the successful buying and selling of his first beast was a long-remembered thrill. Then came a job that thrilled him with delight. He was sought as a pilot. It was indeed an honor in those days at the frontiers. A squatter was overlanding with a big mob of stock, his wagons loaded with a year's supplies. He'd taken up country on the blind at I'd Sea. He needed a pilot to show him the waterholes in his own country. Otherwise, stock might well perish before he located water. Young Kidman with Black Boy Billy had gone wandering with their little herd over that very country. Not another white soul knew it. So the boy got the job. £2 a week, a princely wage, but the honor of it. Pilot to the overlanders. Proudly, he rode towards the setting sun with bearded men beside him and following them the lowing herd, the creaking old wagon driven by the wife of the pioneer. He did the job in a couple of months. He was again and again to be sought for in these, the proudest jobs of his life. He rode back bush, nearing Wilcannia. One afternoon, as he hobbled out Prince and the pack-horse at sundown, a swagman passed by.
Come along and have a feed.
Thanks. They're two decent sorts of nags you've got hobbled out there, especially that roan.
Yeah, not bad. Have you noticed any likely sorts in your travels?
Only at Momba. I passed through the run 3 months ago. There was a lot of horses there with some good-looking trumpers amongst them.
How's the feed?
Pretty dry, but they might have had some rain since I left.
Now the youth knew from the overlanders that there'd been no rain on Momba Station these last 2 months, so the dry feed would now be 3 months drier. The station was heavily stocked with sheep that wanted to feed, and there being no sign of rain, the owner probably would be anxious. Those horses might be had cheaply. Sid knew old German Charlie was always keen on a deal. There might be something in this for him, too. Next morning he saddled up and rode straight bush on the 200-mile trip. He'd never been to Momba before, but he knew the direction was now a good enough bushman to find it. When he'd travelled 100 miles, he rode into a dry belt, grass scarce and withered, the bushes brown. 50 miles further on, he reined up on a low ridge and stared away out over a flat, bright green under herbage and grasses, stock thick upon it, all rolling fat. Cranes and ibises he could see in the distance. Why this green grass, where all else was withered? No rain had fallen for a considerable time in this area, and yet here was a luxuriant flat. Now, what natural cause was responsible? The flat was hedged in by ironstone ridges. He judged it to be 10 miles across, while it spread away apparently another 10 miles to the south, and as far as he could see to the north. Every yard of flat country between those ridges was luxuriantly green. He turned and rode up it to the north. At 10 miles, he saw the big gums of a creek and knew he'd guessed correctly. Floodwaters, and yet not from local rain. It was sundown. The youth unsaddled, hobbled his 2 horses, boiled the quart pot, and by the cheery fire ate his frugal meal. Floodwaters. flood country. Not necessarily flood water from a creek. If a man owned a station with flood country upon it, he would have two strings to his bow. Local rain when it came, flood water probably otherwise, so long as rain fell anywhere at all along the entire upper course of his big creek. The man who owned a station with a lot of low-lying flood country upon it might well have green feed, even though his neighbours were suffering a drought. Next evening, he camped at a boundary rider's hut. He patted the man's dog as he accepted a seat by the fire.
Country's pretty bad.
Yes, we want rain badly.
Hey, I passed over a good strip of country on the adjoining run.
Flood country. No, the creek came down about 2 months ago, luckily for them. That grass is going to save the sheep.
I didn't hear of any rain.
There hasn't been any. No, the water came down from Queensland, down the flood channel to Peru. Rain fell more than 200 miles north of here. Yeah, big storms up there somewhere, and down came a rush of water. Nothing that did anything good for us, though.
Yeah, but plenty of good to any man lucky enough to own a strip of flood country.
They are the lucky ones. Fills their water holes, too.
Sid was wondering why he'd never heard floodwater country being discussed before. Wondering whether there were large areas of it. And if so, whether men had ever definitely sought to take advantage of such. Wondering why the fact and possibilities had never occurred to him before. He saw that mob of clumpers, had a yarn with the owner, and mentioned German Charlie as a prospective buyer. A cheap price was given him. Eventually, Charlie bought and sold at a big profit, with a handsome commission to the boy. By being companionable to that swagman, he'd made a nice commission. And by observation and thought, he'd sown the seeds of fortune. Flood country in future years was to help him fight drought time and time again. Dry times came. Long continued months of scorching suns and unusually fierce dust storms. The tender grasses died first. The herbage withered, then the bushes turned brown and yellow. The waterhole began to dry up. The boy saw Charlie's cattle falling away week by week. At last, German Charlie had to send his cattle away to the Bulka Lakes to save them. Then young Kidman, full of confidence and with 200 pounds in his pocket, decided to battle his way alone through the world, independent of any man. He rode across to Mount Gibbs and bought a small team of bullocks from Jim Bald, part in cash, the balance in payments as he received loadings. He was going in for transport. In this country, and particularly in the more settled area down east, there would be transport opportunities for many years. His first contract was to bring food, supplied from Menindee, 80 miles away, for German Charlie, at £2 per ton. Young Kidman completed his carrying contract for German Charlie, then returned to Menindee. His team had educated him to the fact that he had quite a lot to learn about working bullocks. He was dubious about ever becoming a professional, even with Nelson's help. Nelson, now a full-grown dog, possessed cattle intelligence inherited through a long line of highly trained ancestors. His instinctive cunning in anything to do with cattle was phenomenal. Young Kidman decided that bullock punching was not his line in life. It was a method too slow for him. He liked speed, in horses, in action, in everything. This dawdling along was like dawdling through life. Opportunity was slipping by. There was a good living in bullock driving, but he wanted much more. He felt that life was worth more than merely a living. Sid decided to sell his team and engage in some activity that would carry him along with the tide. He'd stick to stock dealing, a line he believed he knew thoroughly, and by quick movements, quick deals, and quick returns, gain the capital necessary to take up country of his own. So the lad contracted for the loading to Wilcannia, where bullock teams were in demand. Delivered his loading, then sold the team at a profit.
Any outside news?
Yes. I hear rumours there's gold being found way out. I don't take much notice of mulga wires, but there seems to be a real rush out at some place they call Kobar, about 160 miles due east of here. It's copper there, though, not gold.
A rush of men meant business. They would have to be fed. Opportunity would occur in transportation, in business. Stock would be wanted for transport, working and food. Cheerily, he filled his pack bags with food, slung them on the old pack horse, mounted Prince, and winked at Nelson.
We're bound for Kobar, Nelson. You, me, Prince and old Packy. We must ride bush to find it, so if Packy lags behind, you just give him a nip on the heel. Come on.
A week later, he rode into a heart and tent town, its first street now being carved out through the trees. There was an air of activity over the low hills. The axe was ringing. The wheel tracks, every here and there, told of roads soon to be formed, of timber to be carted to this soon-to-be town, of firewood to the rapidly developing mines. All men's thoughts were on copper. But the roving brown eyes of young Sid Kidman and his shrewd questions convinced him that there was opportunity in this place besides copper. He pitched his camp by the main street, then next morning got busy cutting down saplings from the scrub. These he dragged to the camp and erected a bough shed. Finally, he selected a chopping block from the scrub. When this was set in the middle of the shed, he surveyed it with sparkling eyes, standing back and wiping the sweat from his brow. He'd erected his butcher's shop in a day. The miners paid him by fortnightly account, which was another break on rapid expansion. So far in life, in his tiny dealings, he'd paid scrupulously in cash or sharp on date.
Wait, we're back. Wait, come here,
He began to realize the advantages of the system called credit. The business progressed. And he learned another phase of stock work, the actual selling of pressed beef. He had cultivated the knack of estimating the weight of a beast on the hoof, valuable knowledge of stock dealers. Now that he was actually selling beasts by cut-up weight, he learnt by comparison, so that later he could estimate to within a few pounds the saleable weight of an undressed beast. That means a great deal to the buyer and seller of stock. The usual crowd were in his shop one morning when a man came up to him.
Has anyone ever heard of silver away over on the Barrier Range, somewhere near the South Australian border?
No. What's the news?
I don't know rightly. A bloke rode into camp last night and said there's a silver rush out at a place called Thackaringa.
Thackaringa?
Lumps of silver as big as your head they're picking up.
Really?
Or so the mulga wires say.
Young Kidman wondered whether it would not pay him to saddle up and ride quietly away. He knew far more about the barrier than any of these men. But he did not go. Somehow he felt that his life was not to be cast for mining. Stock was his line. He loved stock. Horses and cattle particularly. He clung to the longing to be a squatter. Among the population attracted to every mining town are a number of fly-by-nights. Checkmating these was a constant drain on the youth's time. Before daylight he would mount his horse and ride into the bush, coming out on the one road that led to and from town. He would strike this miles out from the town, and with the dawn come riding back along it. Meeting a surprised man walking beside his dray and belongings, he pulled his horse across the track.
G'day, mate. I see you're leaving.
Well, yes, I am.
Well, I want my money.
Well, I tell you what, you can have it if you can change a cheque. I'm afraid I've got no change.
That's all right. I've got plenty of change.
Opposition came for Sid's butcher's shop in the form of Harry Gellert, who had the cash necessary to buy large mobs of cattle and paddock them near the town. There'd be no waste of time with him. His capital also would enable him to buy and sell more cheaply. Young Kidman immediately sold out to Gellert, before that enterprising man realized his weakness. The town was short of stores. Kidman rode swiftly to Condoblin, 140 miles southeast, bought 2 teams of bullocks, and invested the remainder of his capital, £200, on stores. He drove the loaded teams back to Cobar, outmaneuvering the teamsters lumbering south from Burke. He was rushed, selling the flour at £8 per bag, sugar 1 shilling per pound, salt 6pence, small tins of jam at 2 and 6pence each, soap 5 shillings per bar. Then he sold his teams to the mines, including the teams carting smelted copper. He cleared 100% on everything. In jubilant mood, Kidman considered his next move. He was worth nearly £1,000. He felt very pleased with himself and the world. Sid determined to start buying and selling while traveling to spy out future markets. So, while building up his capital, he would also be preparing for accumulating and selling the great mobs he dreamt of. Youthful ambition soars high. He determined to visit Adelaide and gauge the future market of this coming city of the hills. With Sid Kidman, to think was to act. He rode down the Darling, with Nelson seeing that the old pack horse didn't jog too far behind. In a few days, he caught up with a mob of travelling cattle and recognized in the drovers his brothers, George and Sackville.
It's you. Yeah. Now, they're a nice mob of cattle you've got there. Yes, they're Sacks and mine. From Welford Downs on the Barcoo.
You've been a long way up into Queensland, then?
Yes. And what are you doing?
Looking for a job?
What job?
Well, you're short of a man.
Well, I want a man, but I don't care about giving jobs to relatives. We're going to pick up a man farther along.
Well, how about giving me the job?
Well, you can have it at 25 shillings a week.
Sid smiled. He knew that for a job like this, an experienced man was worth 50 shillings. And Nelson was worth a man and a boy. But at least he was going to be paid for his trip to Adelaide. George was hard, but he did young Kidman good. He insisted on every strap and pannikin being kept shipshape, on cleanliness and tidiness, even though they were going to camp only for a night. Every job had to be carried out with military thoroughness. Sackville was easier going. A strongly built man with good-humoured face and ways. He was a deliberate thinker and was to prove a wise curb on the youth's headlong tactics in time soon to come. As they slowly travelled south across the dry belt and neared the coastal country, young Kidman saw that even in a few years there'd been changes. Country that had been lonely bush when he rode along here on old Cyclops was now cleared, with homes of split slabs upon it, barns and fences too, while the road was much improved and carried considerably more traffic. They spelled the cattle for a week outside the borough, and here Sid was sent across to Kapunda on a business message. He would catch the cattle up before they reached Adelaide. But at Kapunda, he met a surprise that set him dreaming of other things than stock. A Scotch lassie with a Highland bloom in her cheeks and laughter in her eyes. He started love-making with his smile and brown eyes that could say so much. In a few days he rode on, but smilingly promised that he would return soon. Sid Kidman spent his few weeks in Adelaide mostly at the horse, cattle, and sheep sales, and confirmed his belief that this city would grow into a market for stock on a huge scale. He rode back into the bush, hoping that in time he would help supply that market. Even with this great ambition on his mind, he found time to stay a week at Kapunda. When he rode away again, he developed another and equally strong ambition. He wanted the Scotch lass too. He told her that he would return someday, soon. She laughed provocatively and admitted that she might be there. But the Scotch lass was shrewd as well as charming. She saw in this good-looking, smiling young Australian the makings of a big man. Handicapped by lack of education, still he appeared quick to learn. Quietly, she decided that being a schoolteacher, she would be his teacher. She quickly found that his phenomenal memory was to make the task easy. He only needed telling once. He was desperately eager to know anything that had to do with stock. So far as she knew it, she told him the history of stock in Australia. She had a liking for history. Kidman returned to Menindee, eagerly determined to make a start. There he found that cattle in thousands were travelling down the Darling to the Murray and across into Victoria. For the droving of big mobs, horses were in constant demand. He knew just where to get them. He rode across country to Burke's Cave, bought a small mob, and hurried them back. He returned to the Upper Darling with mob after mob, each mob larger than the one before, and all sold readily. But Kidman nearly failed with one mob. He'd bought a fine mob of utilities, in great condition, from two selectors on the Lachlan. He set out immediately for Thackeringa, for Mulga wires were insistent about a rush of men to a big silver find. 2 days later he stared hard at a chestnut. He caught the horse, spat on his hand and rubbed its nose vigorously. The stain came off in his hand. The white blaze down the chestnut's nose was the only weak spot in an otherwise perfect job. He caught horse after horse and examined the brands. But only on one could he detect signs of faking. He drove the horses straight back to those bogus selectors. To his relief, they were still there, standing smoking by the hut door.
G'day.
G'day.
These horses you sold me are all duffed. I want my money back.
We sold you no horses.
Why talk about it? You have a snug plant here? It's worth more to you than the money I paid you for the horses. I'm not afraid of you shooting me. Give me my money back, and that'll be all about it.
I suppose you go and brag about how you got your money back.
Look, I'm not a fool. I'm making my living in this district, horse and cattle dealing. Other people's business has got nothing to do with me.
Why don't you go ahead and sell the horses then? There's quick money in them.
Well, my business is different to yours. I can't disappear in a night. If I sell one horse with a stained nose or a fake brand, well, then my business is settled for, good and all.
Well, I think you better come in, have a cup of tea.
He did so, and eventually got his money back. He rode away without once glancing behind, but with a firm resolve to examine closely every horse and every brand on every horse that he bought in future. Now, Kidman hadn't seen the Scotch lassie for quite a long time. He didn't want to return unless he was on a job. So he loaded up the old pack horse, saddled Prince, and with a whistle to Nelson, rode away northeast. Kapunda lay 350 miles southwest. On the second day out, he met a mob of sheep. Not a soul with them. The sheep, all weathers, were nicely spread out and feeding contentedly along with the dog behind them, as perfect in its care, its watchfulness, its mastery of the situation as a good man. Thackeray Billy was coming behind, driving a cart loaded with baby lambs.
Ah, hey there, Sid.
G'day, Thack. Hey, that's a nice mob you've got.
Yeah, not bad.
Which way have you come?
The Peru, Queensland side.
Any grass?
Oh, yes, plenty.
Hey, you see any horses?
Yes. You buying any?
Yeah.
Well, you ought to pick up a few good sorts cheap this side of the border.
Thanks. How's the water?
Pretty good.
Hey, any movement across on the Queensland side?
Oh, plenty. The country is moving. Victorian capital is going into Queensland, while the Queenslanders themselves are developing their west.
Know anything about the furthest west? Cooper, Diamantina and Georgina?
Oh, only hearsay. Stations are established out there now, but the blacks, well, they're really bad. Water's scarce and the teams are often 12 months on the road. The country isn't the best, and it's isolated from the markets.
I suppose a man would need money to take up country there.
Oh, he surely would. It's a big man's country. Big capital, big distances, big herds, and a heart as big as an elephant.
What sort of country is it near end?
Well, I've only seen the fringe. Nothing like the central country. It's good, but you want miles of it instead of acres. A horse paddock out there is about the size of Ireland.
Oh, I'd like to own 100,000 acres of this country.
Oh, so would I. But they'll eat it out in time.
How?
Overstocking. This saltbush country will hardly carry a sheep to 10 acres all the year round. Yet they're rushing stock onto it as if it was a 1 sheep, 1 acre country at the coast. Oh, well, I must be moving on. I can see me dog looking back from that ridge ahead. So long.
So long.
Sid rode on, thinking. This lesser rainfall country was a hard country, a cruel country, demanding that the survivors of the fittest must use their mentality to survive. Well, he would work physically hard, but would beat the country by using his head, and would put these thoughts into action. Just below Wilcannia, young Kidman struck the junction of the Peru, and turning north, followed the trickling river, lined with its red gums and its yapunya trees whose blossoms gently swayed from the attentions of honey-eating birds. 200-odd miles further north, and he rode among turpentine trees before entering the tiny border township of Hungerford. He travelled on smartly, being more anxious to ride back to Kapunda the further he rode from it. He secured his horses, a good purchase. 70 head of fine, upstanding sorts of £8 per head. He estimated their value to the farmers at the Burra, 700 miles south in South Australia, at £16 per head when he got them there. Yes, a good purchase. That night, as usual when camping on a station, he strolled across to the men's quarters and, squatting on his heels in the kitchen hut, joined in the general conversation. He steered it around to floods, of which there were varied reminiscences.
Cooper's the place. Spreads out there 20 mile or more.
Does it now?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a sight I'd like to see. Must be plenty of flooded country thereabouts.
Oh, there is in places. I was working up at Durham Downs when the Cooper come down. Overflowed the channels and swamped the country into a lake.
Must have been some feed there afterwards.
Oh, there was. Clover a foot high. Like lucerne fields, far as a man could see.
That's the right sort of flood.
It is. Not the sort that Mud Maps was talking about the other night, though.
Who was he?
He's a travelling talking machine. Knocks about the district. Everything he says, he's got to say it with a mud map.
I didn't pass him on the way up.
No, he's cut across to Billy Downs.
What, walking?
No. He's got a couple of good sorts of mares and a good-looking baldy chestnut.
Well, what do you know about the flooded country?
Everything, according to him.
With word to the station manager that he would return later to pick up the horses, he set off after mud maps. 100 miles straight through bush country he'd never been in before, country in which the blacks were not always trustworthy. Here was an additional ride of 200 miles just for a yarn. But the information acquired was eventually to mean the ownership of a strategic string of stations. He saw mud maps fire one evening, twinkling around a gidgee log. He rode up.
Good evening. Good evening.
Mind me unpacking here? I'd like to camp in company.
Oh, same here. Hobble your horses with mine over there. They're sociable too. I'll put the bully on.
They yarned till the early hours of the morning. Mud Maps, with the wrinkles in his weather-beaten face clean cut in the firelight, talked on a subject that he loved. The young man, listening, with his handsome face all attention, listening to a subject that he loved. Kidman jogged his little mob along at the rate of 30 miles a day on that 800-mile ride back to Kapunda, crossing the Queensland border at Hungerford, following the Peru down to the Darling, then from Menindee striking west towards the barrier. He was surprised at the camps scattered amongst the hills. The silver gouges relied for their supplies on bullock teams from Menindee. He rode on, staring up occasionally at men working on the outcrops of rocks. Would a town really develop in this isolation? But water? Even if a miracle supplied water, how could he find water for his dream herds to travel those hundreds of miles down the southwestern Queensland track to here? An impossible dream. At that very time, a tiny group, 300 miles northeast, were gazing on the miracle. Water. Water from the bowels of the earth. That discovery was to prove of priceless value to Australia, far above all the silver mines in the continent. The great artesian basin was to make scores of thousands of miles of otherwise uninhabitable country fit for the habitation of man.